Welcome again on International Women's Day. It's obviously quite an auspicious night to be starting our Monday night series on women in yoga. And as Vicky's already said, really, we wanted to start here with a real analysis of what those terms, what women and yoga might mean. And there's no better way, I think, to set the frame for that and for those conversations than using a sociological analysis to do that. And when we consider that probably around 75% of the practitioners of transnational yoga are women, and we know that most teachers are women. We, as some of you know, we've been doing some audience definition work here at the SOAS Center of Yoga Studies, and so far 70% of you are also women. So given that, and yet at the same time, most of the kind of bureaucratic leaders, the leaders of schools and of kind of yoga teaching bureaucracies and so on and so forth, most of those are men. And we know that hatha yoga as a practice was developed primarily for men. So that difference in demographic is really something I think it's useful to consider and to think about. And particularly how that demographic then intersects with issues of race and colonialism within the kind of history and development of yoga. We're really lucky that Sîan Hawthorne is here to help us frame the debate and the conversation around that. Sîan Hawthorne is a senior lecturer in philosophy and religion at the School of History, Religions and Philosophies at SOAS here at our own institution. Her research interests lie in the areas of intellectual history, religion and politics, narrativity, feminist and post-colonial criticism, and epistemological modeling and theory and method in the study of religions. She is the convener of the SOAS MA Religions and Global Politics, the BA in Global Liberal Arts, and co-founder and co-convener of the BA in World Philosophies, which is a unique degree that focuses on training students in philosophical traditions beyond, but in dialogue with, European and Anglophone philosophy. In conversation with Sîan Hawthorne tonight, Melanie Klein is back to join us. As some of you are aware, Melanie was responding to Seth Powell's work a few weeks ago. Here she's back to talk more about her own perspectives, really, and her own understanding and sociological analysis of transnational contemporary yoga in particular. She's a successful and highly acclaimed writer, professor of sociology and women's studies. Her areas of interest and speciality include media literacy education, body image, and the intersectional analysis of systems of power and privilege. Her work has been featured on outlets familiar to yoga practitioners such as Yoga Journal, Yoga International, Mind Body Green, Mantra Yoga and Health Magazine, as well as Gaiam and the National Eating Disorders Association in the US. And she's a co-founder of the Yoga and Body Image Coalition, which has been at the forefront of online advocacy work to widen public perceptions of yoga practitioners, again in the contemporary arena. We really wanted to make this a conversation because we think that in many ways that's how the best scholarship begins. So this is a conversation that'll begin between Sîan and Melanie, and then at some point we will open it out. As ever, do put your questions at any point into the Slido, and we'll come to those when we get time, as soon as we have the time. It's interesting to me, this wasn't deliberate to have an all-female team tonight, but it's kind of nice to note as much as anything else. So without further ado, Sîan and Melanie, hi.
Hi, thank you all very much for being here tonight. It's an absolute honor to find myself in such great company, but particularly having the opportunity to speak with Melanie, whose work has in fact nourished me for a very long time. As we've already commented, it's not a coincidence that tonight's conversation, which is kicking off the Centre for Yoga Studies series on women in yoga, has been held on International Women's Day. For those of you who don't know, International Women's Day is intended to celebrate social, economic, cultural, political, all the achievements of women, but also to rally for increasing gender parity in all of those domains where much, I think we can all agree, remains to be done. Now, the actual theme for International Women's Day this year is the slogan, "Choose to Challenge," with the added hashtag, "From challenge comes change." Now, as with all slogans, its potential emptiness does present its own challenges. And I hope that some of those challenges come out in the conversation that we have tonight. But perhaps it also presents us some opportunities as well to ask some challenging questions when it comes to the focus of tonight and the kind of change that may need to be part of the way that the relationship between yoga and women is framed, engaged, worked through. Now, in as much as modern postural yoga, and I should of course say here that I have had very little contact with, or in fact, any real familiarity with what happens in yoga. So I'm here very much as a kind of interloper in this conversation. And I'm here really to learn as much as I am to pose some questions. But I think that in as much as modern postural yoga, for want of any better word, has come to signify a kind of globalized, possibly westernized understanding of yoga, there's certainly no doubt that demographically, at least, yoga is dominated by women. The Yoga Journal has estimated that in North America, 75% out of around 15 to 20 million practitioners are female. Quite what they might have meant by that term female, rather than the less incendiary word woman, is not clear to me, but perhaps that's an argument for another time. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps we need to talk about just how expansive an idea woman can be. The UK British Medical Journal survey of yoga practitioners published in 2020 found that out of their 2,434, oddly specific, yoga respondents, including 903 yoga teachers, 87% were women, but 91% were white and 71% were degree educated, and the mean age was 48.7 years. So as a 50-year-old, I find myself again in good company. But here, I think we begin to be able to start to ask a few questions that I thought it might be good to think through tonight. What explains these gender demographics with regard to participants? Perhaps more importantly, why are we making women in yoga a focus beyond this obvious demographic concern? What do we mean when we say women? What political frameworks might we want to bring to bear on asking that question? Is a focus on women warranted? And which women? Where? What connections might we want to make between class, race, disability, sexuality, gender preferences, gender identities, and so on in making women the focus? What has yoga done for women? What have women done for yoga? I think posing these questions tonight will help us to set the scene for an exploration of a number of themes that we thought it was quite important to explore in kicking off the series. And we're going to start by really focusing in on Melanie's fantastic work looking at the relationship between feminist ethics and yoga. But from there, I want us to move to looking at questions of race, racialization, intersections in general, neoliberalism, consumer capitalism, and forms of feminist and queer resistance to those framings that make yoga into something that perhaps isn't your experience of it. What about yoga and sexual/spiritual abuse? Obviously, in a few weeks, you're going to have a specific exploration of that, but we thought it might be useful to spend some time talking through the relationship of abuse, gender, yoga. And then finally, given that we're all here on Zoom, I'm in Italy, Melanie's in America, some of you are in the UK, but also I presume in lots of places in the world. What is the value and challenge of yoga in relationship to questions of gender in a time of COVID and the particular impact that seems to have had on women in particular? So I'm going to hand over in a minute to Melanie to really start talking about her arguments that have been made really over many years now for the kind of feminist ethics that can be derived from yoga embodiment and the forms of empowerment that enables, the kind of transformation, social transformation, political transformation, that it holds out both at the individual level, but also for kind of broader feminist coalitional politics, whether that's a politics of the body, of gender norms, relations to power, relations to the environment with the climate crisis, and to a broader question of how yoga contributes to a form of care ethics. So I guess, Melanie, I would start by really asking you to present us your views, or your kind of where you are with your thinking about the kinds of gender norms that crystallize through and around body. Does forms of yoga that you've been engaging with for so long advocate or subvert or overturn the body norms that we're so, I would think, very familiar with in the lives that we're living at the moment?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, first of all, for Theo and the entire team at the institution here for putting this together. And I have to say, as I was listening to your introduction, Sîan, and everything you're talking about, I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I am so incredibly delighted and excited to be here, because what's happening here, I just want to frame for everyone, is not to be taken for granted. To have this kind of conversation, this kind of elevated conversation, is something that did not exist on any level when I first started practicing yoga in the United States in 1996, nor was it anywhere on the horizon in about 2000, between 2000 and 2002, I started to see significant changes within the yoga community and the culture of yoga. And it was exactly why I started doing the work I did, because I desired to have these conversations and this level of conversation. So it just tickles me to hear it. And it is a reminder of this alone, all of us gathered here, is just a testament to actually how far we've come, how much we've already done. And yet I always like to temper with that. We don't want to confuse that even though we've had a lot of progress, and this very moment is evident of change, that we are not only gathering together to have this conversation, but we're gathering to have this conversation on International Women's Day, something that, you know, just until recently wasn't even recognized in the United States and most countries. It was something that kind of just flew by the wayside. And that certainly this was not something that was recognized within the yoga and wellness community to any degree. And yet, while this is indicative of change and progress, we have so much further to go, so much further to go. And so, Sîan, I'm going to kind of lead into your question with a little bit of personal background, because I want to be clear. I'm here today, obviously, as an academic, a sociologist, a gender women's studies professor, someone who has a long history of doing social justice work, but I'm also here just as, you know, as a woman living in the United States who had discovered yoga and meditation in 1996, and also has just a very personal relationship to this topic, as much as I do a sort of sociological and feminist relationship to this topic. And I think that lends itself to having what I would think is a dynamic and insightful conversation, while at the same time making sure that we aren't getting, you know, too far away from the personal reasons that we're here. So with that, what I'll share is, you know, it's such an interesting moment right now. It's so full circle. I did another International Women's Day event yesterday with Yoga Gives Back, and I had said how full circle this all is for me. Putting on an International Women's Day event as a young woman in, I think it was 1995, it was my first big event that I had organized, because I was so incensed and appalled by the fact that it wasn't until I was in my early 20s walking into my sociology of women class at the local community college that I even had heard about it, that I even knew anything about women's history globally and internationally, that I even had the opportunity to access the legacy and the contributions of women. And it incensed me to the point that I felt compelled into action. That was really, if we think about our click moment, which is a term often used in feminism, what was that moment where the light bulb went on and you moved into action? It was at that moment in my life. And so I had put together that event, something that was incredibly overwhelming for a 22-year-old woman at the time to put together, but I had a lot of, bravado and gusto and enthusiasm and anger, right? So put that together. And then shortly thereafter, I came to my yoga and meditation practice. And what I essentially found is what I was learning in the classroom, what I was studying, and the feminist praxis that I was also implementing was just another component of what was accessible to me through my physical yoga practice and my meditation practice. And that was the ability to really raise my consciousness and kind of go above and beyond the very subjective experiences, the internalized oppression that had shaped my worldview and my relationship to myself, body included, right? And so those were keys to liberation for me. They were keys to freedom. And I know that, those are overused terms. And Sîan, you even said that sometimes, like, even choose to challenge as a theme or a topic, they can become empty platitudes, and sometimes they can be overused. And yet for me, I cannot emphasize that enough. Those were the two keys to my freedom from my depression, from my disordered eating, from my incredibly low self-esteem, from the abusive and toxic relationships that I was in and that I allowed and accepted in my life. This was a pathway out. And so I was so energized and excited about finding these two pieces of the puzzle. And I wanted to, really that becomes the crux of my work. And I wanted to continue to utilize them together. And yet what I found is at that time, there was just a real disconnect within the social justice world and the feminist world from these principles and practices of awareness, mindfulness, and embodiment. They just hadn't really connected. And there was a certain level of, I think, suspicion as well, that they weren't political enough, or they weren't impactful enough, or that they were a distraction or a diversion. And then in the yoga community, specifically in early 2000, a couple of years before Yoga Works, which is a huge corporate entity in the United States, was, and they may have them in the UK, I'm not sure, but that they had bought out Yoga Works, and now we were moving into a corporate model. And I began to see changes happening on the cover of large yoga publications. And I saw absolutely no mention of social justice work, critical consciousness, social and political change. And so both of these spheres that were so incredibly impactful for me I felt like missing a piece of the puzzle. I felt that they were diminishing their potency by not connecting to the other. And specifically, I feel I can be honest enough to say that what started to happen in the culture and the industry of yoga absolutely disgusted me at the time. I'm not going to even mince words. I was completely appalled and disgusted, because one of those aspects of liberation for me was around the relationship to my body. Having a space and a time and a practice that was the antithesis of everything that I had absorbed my entire life through the fitness and the beauty industry, which was literally just jammed into my eyeballs from the time I was a young girl growing up in the 70s, 80s, and then as a teenager in the early 1990s. And so to begin to see those images and those values and those selling points coming into yoga was not only appalling, it was terrifying to me. I was like, oh gosh, this one bastion of sort of solace, this one space where I can disconnect from the cacophony of advertisers and voices trying to sell me products, trying to sell me this low self-esteem so I'll buy into their solutions. It's making its way into here. And I was personally incredibly protective, to be quite honest. I wanted to maintain this one space that was truly sacred and devoid of all of that. And so it became a mission to begin to challenge that particular industry. And yet at the same time, I had to temper that with my own sociologically understanding, which Marx and Horkheimer had talked about, that anything that passes through the filter of the culture will absorb elements of the culture, right? That it's this very fluid and dynamic, and in many ways ephemeral thing. You can't, contain it. You can't, put it in a corner. It is kind of like air. It moves and it interacts and it picks up things. And so it was really about beginning to merge these spheres so that we could have a more critical consciousness in yoga. And avoid the spiritual, bypassing, to move away from that very, I would say, passive way of leaving it up to the universe, not taking action, and feeling that time spent on the mat would somehow cancel out all of the bad choices, bad behaviors, and toxicity that existed everywhere else, right? And going, no, that's not enough, that we pair this together. And at the same time, how do we become aware and socially active and use this information and not get burnt out? And that's where I found these practices going together. And so all of that really led to this work that I'm currently doing and have been doing, specifically in yoga spaces for about 15 years, but it's work I've been doing for 27 years at this point, which is how can we amplify the possibility from each one without watering them down, right? How can we really begin to bring in these conversations of gender and race and class and ableism and sizeism, etc., right? To take the possibility that exists within yoga and wellness spaces and truly make them accessible and have them challenge and consciously reject the ways in which large corporations want to infiltrate the practice with the images and the values and the selling points that they have used for decades, right? That have created the disordered eating, right? Have had an impact with eating disorders, low self-esteem, inaccessibility, so on and so forth, and perpetuating all of these forms of oppression. And it's been, really interesting because there was definitely a lot of backlash when Diane Bondi, Carol Horton, Chelsea Jackson Roberts, Matthew Remsky, and I started bringing this work into the yoga community. People were pissed. They were absolutely pissed. They were a lot of primarily entitled middle class to upper middle class white people, cisgender, who were like, please, this is a space where we don't have to think about oppression. You're ruining our vibe. And there was a massive pushback. Now that has changed. And yet, I kind of mentioned this a little bit when I was here with Seth Powell last month, that there's been a massive shift, but we still see that there is a continuation of some of those themes. And the only way to make changes within the yoga and wellness communities to challenge those things in the larger sort of perspective. This is where we have to push back, right? In those larger corporations. And so there's a lot of entanglement, which I know where I've experienced that people don't like either. They like these very simple sort of, clear binaries in terms of answers or solutions. But I find that part of what the yoga practice has given me and many others that I've had these conversations with is the ability to think critically, holistically, and expansively, where we can be frustrated and yet we can be looking forward, right? We can be angry, but we can also be hopeful, that our capacity to see a larger possibility becomes clear. And ultimately, that has been my intention and my work and my mission personally with the Yoga and Body Image Coalition, with all of my collaborations and the books, is let's really bring these pieces together so that we have some authentic, deep, and real conversations that aren't, I won't get that as crude as I was about to. No, you know what? I'm going to, because I went to a sociological conference. I was like, this is just a big circle jerk. I know that was I get it, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in having this conversation and waxing philosophical and poetic and deep, and everybody just gets excited about how lofty these ideas are. No, I want to be on the ground. This is, boots on the ground, real work. And so I want to inspire people to think that way and then go into, and how do we use that? How do we bring this into a call for action? Which is varied and expansive, right? It can look a lot of different ways, but how can you uniquely contribute to a framework that is different than the one that we're experiencing? How do we continue to move this forward? And Sîan, I know you didn't ask me all of that, but that's my starting point. So you just go in wherever you want to.
That is just such a great answer, because I think, it really begins to connect things that up until now, I was just kind of thinking, well, we'll talk about this and then we'll talk about that. And actually, these things are really, really entangled with each other. The way that you're putting, yoga practice in conversation with your feminism, and your feminism in practice with your yoga practice, but neither are kind of remaining sealed from the broader context of the necessity of always already critiquing the capitalist structures that insist on keeping many of these things apart, of insisting that, you know, spirituality, for example, for want of a better word, is something that always has to be sequestered from the real, that isn't a force that we use to kind of work on the world and change it for better, that insists that certain bodies really have to fall beneath any kind of notice, that certain bodies really aren't part of changing the world or changing the way that the world looks, of challenging how we're going to understand beauty, and far beyond, you know, appearance, really, who is the person and how do we kind of bring value to that person, the personhood of the person in the world. And I think, you know, one thing that's really struck me about the work that you've been doing is a real rethinking of what beauty can be, because, you know, you kind of look at all of those yoga journals and magazines, and it's kind of advertising of itself, that kind of corporate takeover of yoga, where you've just got these very idealized bodies that are almost always white, almost always young, very rarely disabled or differently abled, or you know, kind of conveying a kind of sense of economic well-being and so on. And it seems to me that partly where you've been driving to is a kind of idea that yoga cannot be this exclusionary discourse, because that kind of runs against both your feminism and against your practice as a yoga. And it'd be really interesting, I think, to really kind of talk about what you mean by beauty in your work. How is this a product of your thinking together of both yoga and your feminism, that you're moving against yoga as this specific script, that you're trying to develop a transformational notion of beauty, which is so much more holistic? I think you put it as the propensity to feel beautiful rather than merely looking pretty. Now, of course, that could play into the hands of a culture which is always placing the burden of appearance or equating beauty with appearance on women. So I think I'd be really interested to hear you talk about the value of beauty, in fact, as an ethics both towards the self, but towards the other in the world, of a form of care, an orientation of care, and also a form of empowerment.
I love that you found that quote, or that piece that I said. That was many years ago.
That piece. I love
about how to looking a certain way versus feeling a certain way. And I'm going to get to that. And yet something you said early that I don't talk about that often, but I really want to present to the people here, because I think it's important. You know, there is still this tendency to mimic and mirror, and in the process of mimicking and mirror, reaffirming, right, those sort of mainstream normative standards of beauty, as you know, you had said and had mentioned earlier. It was like of being white, of being thin, of being, you know, able-bodied, so on, you know, bringing all of those things into play. And it's so important to have representation. I mean, part of my background is media literacy within sociology and feminism. So that is a lot of where the work that I have done within the yoga and wellness community was around representation, right? And, you know, challenging the industry, from, you know, Yoga Journal to Gaiam, you know, to doing collaborative work with Yoga International to begin to create a new framework with the intention of accessibility, and really beginning to disrupt now the social media feeds, which, by the way, didn't exist in 2010, 2011, right? It really wasn't until Instagram came into the fold, which was, gosh, maybe 2012, 2013, that we saw even a greater emphasis on the imagery, and to disrupt that. That's been part of, you know, the intention of my work, right? And yet what has been interesting to me, and also equally disturbing, is a lot of my colleagues and community partners and allies that I have who are, you know, in larger size bodies, differently abled, etc., they began to receive a lot of attention and did disrupt the feed. But what I found problematic was not that part. That part was incredibly welcomed, was the way in which I felt that they were not only tokenized, but became on display in a way by large companies, I want to be clear, that almost fetishized their bodies, that saw them as some like circus act carnival trick. And it makes me so incredibly uncomfortable and angry. And I feel there has to be conversation about that, because we're not just looking to disrupt and then to have tokens, and we don't want to fetishize. We really want to have some authentic representation across the board. We don't want to go from one extreme to the other, where each one becomes just, you know, something that is, just completely commodified, objectified. And so that happens on, you know, both ends of the spectrum. So I really wanted to put that out there and make a point, because so often I saw people, influencers and companies who had never shown any interest in any of these topics before go, oh, great. Okay, this is the, you know, the hashtag du jour. I need to go ahead and get on this train, use this, and I'm going to start sharing some of these things. And it was almost like, hey, look, look, look. And I was like, ooh, that lands really, really poorly. Like that stinks to high heaven for me. Like, let's really do this work authentically and not on these surface levels, right? And then when it comes to answering that part of your question, Sîan, right, and completing that piece that I wanted to share, you know, talking about all of the intersections, and that it's all interwoven. It's, as you said, entangled. At any point in history, right, there are going to be notions of beauty, of desire, of, you know, what we should aspire to be, to look like. And all of those are very much reflective of the socioeconomic, historical, and political forces at work at the time. That from a sociological lens, everything that we experience, that we name, that we create is a social construct, right? It's kind of like, none of it's real, emperor's clothes, it has meaning because we've given it meaning. And yet, because we've given it meaning, it becomes real through that. And so when we look at that, we have to understand beauty as a concept, right? It's a concept in which we've attached a meaning, and the meaning is rooted in the value system, the economic systems, the political systems that are at work that historical period in that particular geographic place. And that beauty is not only reflective of those things, but it's constantly changing. It is, you know, because culture is constantly changing, and it's going to be different in different places at different times. And at the same time that we can understand that, and some people might then say, well, then it's not a problem. It's something that exists in every society throughout history, which it does. The difference is here. In our mediated culture, where we are, especially now during, you know, with COVID, we are rarely unplugged. We are rarely disconnected. We are constantly, right, exposed to these images, to these messages, to these ideas, to these lifestyles that we are basically seduced and encouraged to embody and strive for. What's different is that even 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we did not have the same level of mediation of these images that we do now, right? So Joan Jacobs Brumberg wrote a book really looking at notions of beauty among young American women over time. She did like a 120-year analysis. And so we don't even see an emphasis on weight or sizes of clothes until we had standardized clothing. Because prior to that, right, clothing was sewn at home. Clothing was constructed to your body. So you weren't thinking of, oh, am I a size 14, a 12, a 20, a 2, right? Like that wasn't part of the equation. There wasn't an emphasis on weight. There wasn't even an emphasis on skin and things, because most people didn't have mirrors. You rarely saw yourself, right? And you did not have media imagery even in newspapers. Like you had very little of that. That changed with the advent of photography. So if we look over a 100-year span, which means that, so it's, 2021. So in 1921, my great grandmother was 18. And if I go back even further, my great great grandmother was a young woman prior to photography, prior to, way before television, prior to standardized clothing, that in a very relatively short period of time, not only have we developed a more unrealistic concept of beauty through, it used to be airbrushing, but now it's obviously through, all of the different photoshopping and digital alteration, but through the amount of imagery that we're exposed to. Even, I was born in 1972, and I was part of what was called the MTV generation, where we saw the video vixens. We saw the women, gyrating in very little clothing and heavy metal and rock videos, right? Where we were reading Teen Beat and Teen Vogue and all of these different things. I was really the first generation to do that in the 70s and 80s. My mother, born in 1949, right? The television wasn't even invented till 1942. It wasn't until the late 40s, early 50s that, most American homes had one television. Because in my mother's case, living in Germany after the war, where our property was bombed, I don't think they had a television in their home until the mid 50s, until maybe she was 7 or 8. And then it was one television with a limited amount of programming. So we have to begin to look at this and recognize it's not just mainstream images of beauty, but the degree to which we're exposed to them and how much that has drastically increased, as well as how limiting that image has been. And the fact, here's the third piece, that we are expected to aspire to them. So if we are looking at some of the big, movie sirens of the 50s and 60s, so let's say Marilyn Monroe, Jane Russell, Marilyn Mansfield, Elizabeth Taylor, they were called movie stars. Nobody really uses that term anymore, right? It's so dated. They say celebrities or influencers, but not movie stars. Movie stars were people who were seen as different from the average person, and that you might, desire them. You might want to kind of aspire to look like them or be like them. You didn't actually think it was possible. And nobody expected you to, because they were movie stars. That was something different. They were completely kind of, in a league of their own. And that the average person, you might have a standard of beauty, but it wasn't as emphasized. It wasn't as expected. So to give you an example, I looked at my grandmother's high school yearbook. She graduated, sometime in the mid 40s. And I looked at all of the young women in those pictures. And some of them were what at the time the term would be called plain, or they would use the term homely, right? Those were terms that were used in the 40s and 50s. And yet they actually weren't valued any less. That there were multiple ways, and even though this was gender specific, there were multiple ways women, right, had value. And, maybe they were charitable. They were, whatever. My grandmother was actually in the math club, which was kind of rare, or they were a writer, or they ran track, or they were a great baker, right? That's something gender specific, but it didn't just rely solely on what they looked like. And so what we also begin to see from the 1990s onward, including in yoga, was greater emphasis on what you look like and a greater expectation to emulate the increasingly difficult definitions of beauty that had been constructed. And it was through the process, right, of cultivation. There's something called cultivation theory. George Gerbner came up with that. The idea that it's not one image, right? Because people will get very defensive, like, oh, well, this one thing or this handful of things can't change your mind. No, that's true. It's the cumulative and repetitive exposure that we completely take for granted and that we don't even consciously recognize anymore. We are more likely to notice deviations from the norm than we are the norm, but it is the norm that actually sets the framework for the way that we see the world and the way that we see ourselves and each other. And so what we have now, it's not just the standard of beauty that we have, or the fact that beauty exists at all as a definition and a currency system. It's the degree to which it is peddled, the degree to which it's absorbed, and how incredibly difficult it is to even aspire to that because it doesn't exist. For a number of years, I did a variety of workshops with a man named Ray Q, who was a professional, person in digital alteration. And we did a workshop showing that most images that we see, right, have gone through at least 30 rounds of edits. And he had said by the time we are exposed to an image that are created by large corporations, right, there's not one original pixel, not one original pixel that exists anymore. And when we're looking at influencers, there was a new Netflix documentary that just came out a couple weeks ago where they did an experiment to create Instagram influencers. Even there, what we have to consider, these are not spontaneous images that we're seeing anymore. It's literally not an Instagram. That was what Instagram meant. Real-time photos taken and then shared. It's not an Instagram anymore. These are all installators, right? Where they have professional lighting teams. They have hairstylists and stylists and makeup artists. And then on top of that, filters are used. That this is unlike anything we've seen in human history, that we are aspiring to literally look like images that are not real, and we are reprimanded when we don't. And that is no different in the yoga community, because while there are a lot of very skilled practitioners and teachers, let's face it, the people who become influencers are not always the most talented ones. Sîan Hawthorne of Off the Mat, who has an essay in my first anthology, Yoga and Body Image, talks about that. She said, I was very clear in the 80s and 90s that I was chosen not because I was the most skilled, but because of my hair, because of my body, because I was young and considered attractive. The difference with her is she chose to use that platform to create change. But that's not always what we see. So I know that's a long answer, but there are a lot of pieces, right? It's not just about what it reflects, but how it also exists in a very different framework than anything that we've seen previously.
I think I'm very interested in this kind of visualization of the yoga body and the way it's playing into all of those forces that you're identifying. But I think one thing that we haven't touched on yet, but one thing that seems to me as quite an outsider, but someone who is viewing these images, is the degree of the performance of the whiteness of the yoga body, and the way in which the ideal yoga body is this deracinated, racialized body. The preponderance of white people that are kind of cultivating this this idealized, unachievable, and yet all too achievable form of racialization in this body. And I think the thing that disturbs me, I suppose, most about yoga as it's become this kind of globalized phenomena is the extent to which it's not that there's been a spiritual takeover, there's been a kind of appropriative takeover by white people of a tradition or set of traditions, in fact, as well as kind of contemporary instantiations of it that are almost entirely divorced from the populations and the communities for whom it has an altogether different meaning, who aren't associating it with forms even of necessarily kind of personal empowerment, but or even indeed having anything to do with empowerment or liberation as perhaps a kind of liberal imaginary is going to understand it. And I'm quite interested, therefore, in how we might then begin to talk about the quite uneasy, well, actually toxic, frankly, relationship that there is between white feminism, its specific priorities, its kind of repackaging of appearance norms, or trying to kind of dissociate from that. In some ways, we could almost see kind of white people practicing yoga as engaging in a form of kind of brown face, if that's not being too extreme, of just kind of adopting personas which do not belong to them, which they have really literally no connection to, and which they make sure they have no connection to because they strip out all of those elements of the traditions that perhaps they find not amenable to what they want to make out of yoga. We could talk about, historical gender, as well as, of course, caste-based hierarchies within various Indian, I don't want to keep calling them traditions because that kind of reinforces that kind of rupture that there's apparently between tradition and modernity. It's not so much that, but these kind of communities of practice for whom the yoga body is not about appearance, but it is about a form of or various forms of soteriological discourse and practice that are moving towards something altogether. And so I think something that's been concerning me with looking at yoga in this, I have to keep saying this very kind of tangential way, is what are the kind of racial politics in this, even in the idea that yoga is for everyone. Is it? Is it really?
Well, I mean, it's not right now, no.
No, it's not. But even, and it's a very complicated question, because yoga, even in India, in this perhaps idealized historical golden age that we might want to imagine, again, wasn't for everyone, right? So it wasn't for women, it wasn't for non-Brahmins. It had all sorts of kind of exclusions that were built into its practice. But I think there's something particularly pernicious, perhaps, and it's a question rather than a kind of statement, when white people begin to take up and take it over, and it becomes this way in which non-white people are not present in the yoga studios, are not present in the kind of even income generation of yoga. And whether that's kind of inevitable as it becomes globalized, or what kind of politics could be cultivated in order to not sever that connection to the communities for whom it was an altogether different resource. But it's complicated by gender then, isn't it?
Yeah, so that alone, I mean, as I'm listening, I'm like, okay, that is an hour conversation right there. The last thing, that's an hour. Like literally each of these segments we've had could be an hour to 2 hours on their own. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with the first sort of thing that came to my head as I was listening, and hopefully that will kind of open the door, potentially lead to some other places and even continued conversations. And that is, there, as a sociologist, one of the things that always comes up, and one of my focuses has also been on culture, the media literacy aspect, the body image aspect, the intersectional aspect, right? But culture, just like society, is an ever-changing thing. Ideologies and, aspects, both material and non-material aspects of culture, none of them are fixed. They're not rigid. It's just impossible, right? So it goes back to this idea that everything that passes through the dominant culture gets absorbed by it, and it absorbs components. So I think on one hand, inevitably, there are going to be shifts in anything, and I'm not just focusing on yoga, right, but just anything. We look, if I'm really fascinated too by looking at migration routes and trade routes, and what did that mean for the cultures that came into contact with one another? How did they each change, right? And so when we see that, we have to understand that cultural diffusion is inevitable, right? Cultural change is inevitable, and yet we can't run with that so far where we deny the cultural appropriation, the racism, and the colonialism, right? There's a fine line between those two things. And if we're looking at, sort of yoga and the centering of the white, young, able-bodied body, we have to consider, obviously, how that becomes a reflection of the systems in place, the system of patriarchy, the system of white supremacy, the system of classism, the system of, really fetishizing and objectifying young, able-bodied bodies. So there's that. But if we go even further, it's simply like colonialism is about, I'm going to say it, we take whatever the fuck we want. It's like, we're entitled to it, right? We don't apologize about it. We don't even think about it. Everything is here for us. If in the United States, we look at that specifically, right? We obviously see, right, as we begin to have settlers coming into the quote new world, which had already existed for a long time, right? This very ethnocentric way of relating to this land and its indigenous people. And then, of course, you know, with our history of chattel slavery and what that meant, and then westward expansion, manifest destiny, it was like God has ordained us this right, this entitlement. That was what George Bush Jr. and Donald Trump were saying. I've been appointed by God. I am entitled to all of this, right? And we see it not only in the United States, but we see it, right, throughout the British Commonwealth. We see it in the whole slogan that was like, wherever the sun sets, always on somewhere on the British Empire. I completely butchered that. Yeah, there you go. The sun never sets on, right? I mean, it's like you go where you want and you take what you want, right? These people are heathens. These people are less than. You are the
not
rightful
only that,
people.
it's also presented as this kind of benevolent exercise, right? So it's
Yes.
not even that we're just taking. It's like, oh, but we're also giving back. There's things
Yes.
that we're giving back. We're making
Yes.
this better in some kind of way. I mean, the lies that white people tell.
Well, I mean, you know, even in this election in the United States and the one previously, there were several Republican senators who made the point that chattel slavery was a benefit to
Right.
African Americans. Okay.
Right. I mean, the mind boggles, and yet it's not absurd. I mean,
so
it's recognizable.
Yeah. So there's the entitlement, the taking. It is ours for the taking. And as you added, right? So importantly, it's like, and we're making it better. This is actually a service to everyone. And so yoga is no different. It's like, I think there's been a complete disconnect for so many North American and Western practitioners of, well, it feels good, I benefit, so of course I do with it what I want. I package it like I want. I sell it like I want. I take the parts that I like and I move the rest aside. And this is fantastic. I feel good about it. I'm offering something great. I'm not doing any harm. So it's just a part of that larger conversation that can only, right, be remedied when we get honest about the colonialism, the white supremacy in the United States, the legacy of chattel slavery and what that's done uniquely there for race relations, and the way people, you know, kind of view that. Otherwise, it's going to be constantly perpetuated. And yet we know that between white guilt and white shame, there are a lot of people who do not want to have a conversation because they feel that it is somehow a direct attack and it is direct blame. Obviously, I'm a white woman. I've been doing anti-racist work for 25 years as part of my intersectional feminism, right? And it's like, no, we do not have to be culpable. We can use our awareness, our privilege for good, and we can listen without going all up in our feelings, right? That whole thing, white tears, like we don't have to go in there. That completely, again, centers us over what needs to happen in the conversation. And there is a way that we can do it where we are truly listening, truly growing, incredibly receptive. But that means that you better do some freaking work on yourself. You better start to go ahead and seek that out and not ask a person of color to educate you, which is honestly another part of the reason that I, as a white woman, speak to other white people so that I can lift the burden, right, off of my colleagues, my friends, and my allies in communities of color. It is not their job to do. That is more emotional labor, right? And so that has been a huge crux of this work, is we can't just look here, right? We're obviously talking about deconstructing gender in yoga, but that means we are required to deconstruct race. We are required to deconstruct class and ableism and sizeism. And we have to look at nationalism. We have to look, obviously, at the role also in the United States that Christianity plays. Yeah. Because it's very clear when Obama ran both times, and with Trump, it's like, this is a white Christian nation for men, right? And what that all means. So we have to look at all of it. And to a lot of people, it feels overwhelming and it's inconvenient and they don't want to do it. But if we're really committed to this work, that's exactly what we need to do.
But what if that means that you're no longer allowed to practice yoga?
With that, you know, that is a really important question. And I've had, there was a conversation Susanna Barkataki did recently. My other colleague, Anusha, and I do a lot of work. And we've had these conversations, and from what they've shared, that's not actually the intention or the desire in having this conversation, right? And yet for me, I'll be very, very honest. If it's not so much if someone's not allowed to practice, I think it's a matter of if you're allowed to teach or to profit off of it,
Right.
which for me personally, this is going to go, well, let's go there. I've gone to a lot of other places today. When COVID hit and really started to turn over this entire industry, I mean, Anoush and I were talking, and I did an interview with her. I was like, let's burn it all F to the ground. Let's do it. Let's really get real. Let's remake it, because it is in a major transition point right now. And for me, I do believe, and I have for a long time, that maybe it isn't a company or mission for specifically white people to profit off of. Absolutely. And I'm personally fine with that. There's a lot of other things we could be doing. There is a lot of other ways that we can bring our yoga practice into what we do. And it doesn't mean we have to be teachers. And I know there are probably teachers or aspiring teachers here who do not like to hear it. That's okay. I'm going to say it anyway, right? It is something to think about. Like, what are all the different ways you can do this work? Just because someone loves yoga or has benefited from yoga doesn't mean they should be teaching. It doesn't mean that they should, right? I've never done that. For me, it's been like, how can I use this practice to elevate the quality and the degree of the work that I do? How can I amplify voices? So for me, it was about creating the coalition. For me, it was creating these anthologies to bring these diverse stories to people. Like, I did an interview for Yoga Teacher magazine. And they're like, I think you're the only yoga teacher who's not a yoga teacher that we've ever interviewed, right? And because what it's saying is there's this one-dimensional framework of what that's supposed to look like. And I just encourage people to look beyond that. How can you take the things that you're learning in your yoga studies, your yoga practice, and weave it into many other forms? Like, there's not one way to do this or to live this. So, yeah, it answers your question, I think, to a degree, and adds some additional things, but I think it's an important thing.
I think there's also kind of complication that comes in when you begin to examine perhaps some of the caste issues. And I think it was, I'm trying to remember her name, I think it was Prachipatankar, who was talking about how this kind of accusation against white people of kind of appropriating yoga was problematic for her as a Dalit woman. Who was kind of saying that actually this globalization of yoga has in fact in many ways opened up yoga for people who were nonetheless excluded from it within the South Asian context. And so she was like, you know, we need to be wary when we start to have these kind of broad brush strokes to kind of, it's either one or the other, that there are these more marginalized communities that, you know, the South Asian community is as heterogeneous as any other. Sorry, I don't quite know when my camera's gone off. As heterogeneous as any other community is, such that when we start to kind of tackle these questions of race and of cultural difference, that actually there is a heterogeneity to the South Asian context that stands to lose once we stop, perhaps, to put it very, very, very generously, democratizing yoga. And I think there's always going to be that tension there, isn't there, when we're having these conversations about the appropriative dynamics of white people taking over or taking on yoga, and yet there's the potential for allyship with Dalit and other marginalized communities who also kind of want to join in with that opening up of yoga, particularly Dalit women, you know, the subaltern, having the literal subaltern, the subaltern woman having that capacity to really kind of join in an empowering move as a form of resistance, as a way of marking her place in the world and her right to take on a highly Sanskritic discourse, and yet to do something very specific with it for her own benefit and for the benefit of her community.
Yeah, Theo, I think you wanted to say something, right?
Well, I wanted to say, I mean, the first thing I want to say is this really is a conversation I think we could have for hours, and I'm really grateful for that, but I'm slightly aware with my organizer hat on at the time. I did want to make one point, which is for me personally, I think it always comes back to not so much appropriation as exploitation. And that question of who is profiting is a really important one. And I think that a lot of the transparency that we're starting to see around really practical issues about who's earning the money is really interesting. And I know that there's people doing that work, at least here in the UK. The new Yoga Teaching Union is a really interesting one for that, because we have this, $16 billion a year industry, and yet the vast majority of yoga teachers are teaching for very, very little money, and being very exploited for what they do. And I think that for me, what I'm seeing in terms of signs of resistance is that there is another way possible. And that one of the ways possible is to do the work that actually works with marginalized communities, that opens the practice up, and so on and so forth. And I know that amongst myself and the friends that I have who do teach yoga, when we do that, actually there's a solidarity and a mutual aid that means that no one needs to be earning 27 pence for turning up for a class and paying for their own parking and so on and so forth, that we can do that together. And it's there's much less scarcity within the system when the corporate entities are not siphoning all of that profit out, basically.
No, 100%.
Yeah,
real quick, just on that, so we can have Q&A and stay on time, because I'm very much about that too, is, we also have to consider, if we're looking at Paramahansa Yogananda bringing, yoga to, specifically here where I live in Southern California, in the early 1900s, and setting up the Self-Realization Fellowship and training people. And think about all of the, big teachers from the 90s and early 2000s in the United States who had actually been trained by specifically Pattabhi Jois. He had an entire lineage here. And so we also have to consider that component. And so, I like that framing of the exploitation. And yet, I really appreciated that very controversial question, Sîan, right? Because that does come up. And so there's a lot of really great things to look at. And Rolf Gates, he wrote an essay for Yoga and Body Image as well. And what I loved about he talked about what's so great about the yoga community, and that I agree, is that because we're a microcosm of the macrocosm, we may reflect the mainstream, but we have a smaller space in which we can begin to create the change. And, Rolf Gates in that essay, and kind of like I've talked about, none of this needs to look this way. And Theo, you were talking about, and Sîan as well, democratizing and changing the system. We have sort of a smaller entity to reframe and rework, which then can work itself out, as opposed to sometimes working here and then having all of these sort of, subcultures and countercultures to then take suit. So that's the part that's exciting to me. And that is what inspires me to keep doing this, is these conversations, the way that each person takes that and moves it into their life, and then what becomes possible in this sort of, if you will, a microclimate that we have going on in the yoga community. So thank you so much for giving me this time and space, because I love talking about this, obviously.
Well, I think we could hear you talk all night, but I'm aware that, there have been mostly two white women holding the floor here. And perhaps it's time to open the floor to everyone else that's white.
I'm
just constantly looking at the screen and going, oh gosh, well, there we go.
And it's but it's, I still think that the questions are important, and I'm really excited about the questions that we have been posing here, particularly you, Sîan. I think it is useful sometimes to have people coming in who have an experience and understanding of the practice, but aren't invested in the same way, so that you're able to ask those questions, because otherwise, they're the questions that we sometimes never get asked otherwise, I think. We do have a number of questions. I'm really wary that some of these could take another hour and a half. But we have the first one, the one that's got the most votes, is from Carlos Garcia Jane. I wonder, Ruth or Vicky, can you find Carlos and ask them to unmute themselves? That would be
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Hey, you're there. Hey, Carlos, do you want to ask that
Hiya.
question directly?
Yeah, you have touched upon it somehow when you talked in the last response about racism and all that, but I was wondering whether you have thought about there's been recent articles talking about the spiritual conceit in yoga, superiority complexes, and also because of racism in America recently and Trump and all that, the fact that a lot of within the yoga community, a lot of people are very supportive of very alternative sort of theories, QAnon, and that sort of thing, and whether you have thought, what is it that makes so many people within the yoga community so prone to sort of be inclined towards that?
Yeah, it has been fascinating to watch this play out over the last year. So I'm glad you asked, Carlos. What I will say, both in the interest of time and two, personally, I'm going to reference a few things because I'll be honest, that was such a triggering space for me for so many reasons. I did not dive into that as deeply. I sort of paid attention to what was happening. I kept my finger on it, but I just didn't go down the rabbit hole, even beginning to theorize about that, because quite honestly, one, it was triggering. Two, it was a conservation of energy. Right now, my son is at home, and in a few minutes, I have to make him lunch, and there was only so much that I could take on. And three, I felt that there were a lot of people who were really taking the time to dive into that. And so one of my colleagues, Julian Mark Walker, who's here in Santa Monica, and Matthew Rebsky up in Toronto, they created the Conspirituality podcast. They've done an incredible amount of work on that. I would highly recommend anyone who is interested in those conversations and those theories, check out their Facebook pages and then go to the podcast. There is an incredible amount of material there that really goes into all of the details that I think you're probably looking for.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I'm joyous to find out that our next question is from Amelia Wood, who I can actually find because she's under the A's. Amelia.
Hi. So have you felt pushback from the academic yoga studies community, or felt that your work was kind of excluded from the yoga studies discourse? And I'm just asking this because when I did my master's at SOAS in 2014, I didn't come across your work at all, even when I was quite clear that my interest was the relationship between yoga and gender politics. Or is it just or have you kind of been in conversation with the yoga studies academic world in the US and maybe not so much in the UK? I wondered about that.
Yeah, great question. No, I haven't felt that. In fact, I've had lots of people from internationally, grad students, et cetera, over the last 10 years reach out to me and talk about how the work that's been put out there has been part of their thesis or, incorporated into their research, et cetera. And second of all, my intention was not to create a lot of academic volumes purposely. So there is the book, the academic volume from Rowman and Littlefield, the publishers, with Dr. Beth Barilla and Dr. Chelsea Jackson, where we talk about embodied social justice, that came out in 2016. That's really the only academic tome, if you will. The other three anthologies, Yoga and Body Image 2014, Yoga Rising 2018, and then Embodied Resilience last year, they were purposely published as trade paperbacks. I actually, obviously I'm an academic, I love it, but I was turned off by the academic community when I started going in this direction in the early 2000s, and the larger sociological gender women's studies departments who basically looked at this as an area of study that was completely unimportant, uninteresting. They did not understand that. And so I threw all of my PhD applications in the trash, and I made the commitment that I was going to use my master's degree. I was going to go into the classroom to teach the level that my master's degree would allow me, which is the community college and as an adjunct at a 4-year, and devote my life to being a public intellectual. So part of it could be that they are trade paperbacks and they're not quote, studies, research studies, although there is that one. So both of those things, one, I haven't ever noticed that those have not come up where there's been any kind of pushback. And the other part is, and I'm going to be real crass too, I don't give a shit. I don't want it to only be in that realm. I want it to be accessible to everyone. And I knew a trade paperback using personal narratives, weaving in these themes was a much more powerful and potent way for me to reach the people that I felt actually needed the information. So thank you for that question.
I wonder if Sîan would agree with me that part of what's going on is a disciplinary difference here, is that sometimes I think it's less about not wanting to look at certain subjects as much as philologists and historians are really feeling out of their comfort zone, talking about sociological theory and so on, and vice versa. The yoga studies, as we all know, is such a broad field, right? No one can have a handle on all of it. So I think it's probably more to do with individual academics' zones of comfort, maybe. Do you think?
I think I would kind of agree with that. I mean, I would kind of think that they're all a bit shit, really, when it comes to this. Yes. I mean, I was trained in the study of religions, probably one of the most kind of intellectually bankrupt, if not, backward fields that you can get with its kind of investment in phenomenology, which is effectively all of these kind of secular people who still nonetheless couldn't kind of get over their hankering for some kind of theological investment. So it was this kind of crypto theology that comes in. And so, they were just as wary of kind of adopting things like, gender theory or queer theory or Marxism or, critical theory more generally, was just a kind of avoidance of that, because it actually forces you to stop making a big deal about the stuff that you're dealing with, that you actually have to confront the history of your own thought and then perhaps stop thinking in that way, because the way that you've been taught to think in the history of your thought is so invested in all the really truly bad things in the world, like racism, like colonialism, like misogyny, and so on and so forth. And so academic disciplines tend to really kind of avoid confronting those important, quite central, and I would say questions that are the mark of, are you going to be a good scholar or are you not? So I would say that most of what passes for scholarship is fear and is cowardliness, and I should probably not keep speaking.
No, but I think you're right, Sîan. I agree with you 100%. That these things specifically in these areas are absolutely new. I'm familiar with David White at UCSB, religious studies, yoga studies, the Loyola Marymount here in Los Angeles, their yoga studies program. These things are just now getting incorporated. It's brand new. I feel
it's embarrassing.
So, just as it's brand new for, let's say, the yoga industry and I would say the culture at large to be having these conversations and making shifts in filmmaking and television and print magazines, advertisements, and all of the various subcultures, it's new here as well. So there's a lot of pieces.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
And yet, before we completely dismiss scholarship generally, of course, I mean, there are, there are techniques, there is a kind of critical faculty, there is a kind of method to it that I hugely value, that kind of precision, that care, that close reading, that not really kind of accepting orthodoxy, at least ideally, and also the dialogue that it tries to cultivate, that fact that we meet, we speak, and we hold each other to account. Academia at its very best is that, right? It holds us to account, it keeps us honest, and it keeps us having to, work with each other and not just produce or reproduce that pathetic image of the kind of ivory tower and the scholar working away in kind of heroic isolation. That is not how the best thinking happens. And I think the best thinking that happens in scholarship now is where some of those hierarchies have also been broken down, and where we're not kind of stuck inside the tower. We are we're sharing our humanity with those whose lives we're so invested in, and who we wish to contribute to, knowing that they contribute to the way in which we think just as much. So, you know, I think there's signs of hope. There's these little green shoots, and the conversation keeps going. And I think that it's probably going to be a much better conversation going forward.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done on the politics of knowledge, whether in yoga studies or whether in these other fields that those of us who are in academia or are working in. There needs to be a democratization of that space just as much. And I learned that from my Black colleagues. I didn't learn that from my largely white colleagues. And so that's where I would say that my intellectual debt is really to the Black women that are in my life and have, you know, done the work in a way that I've never actually had to do. So I would honor them here. Thank
you. I think that's a good place to bring it to an end. I'm really aware of the kind of the responsibilities that we all juggle, and that Melanie has responsibilities she needs to juggle in terms of feeding her son as well, and you know, the ways in which conversations happen in community, but also a balance with we have to balance the scholarship and the yoga with the real work of kind of, you know, keeping our families together and keeping ourselves together and doing what needs to be done. I'm gonna, rather than give in any way a last question, there is one question that's really high up on the slide that I think is one that we can leave unanswered, because I think it's one that we could all do with thinking about, which is and this one's anonymous, so I can't go to the person involved, but how do we create real inclusivity and accessibility in yoga in a capitalist setting, balancing creating an inclusive community and the necessity to make a profit? And that the impossibility of answering that question is I think where our yoga practice and our scholarship can meet in many ways, you know.
But I think that's also tells you what the project is, right? That's the
project
job.